I have told this story only twice in my life. Once to my wife, on the night she asked me why my brother, the most feared man in 4 counties, the Duke whose name silenced rooms and whose displeasure had broken careers, fortunes, and the occasional spine, wept at his own wedding. And once to my eldest son, when he was old enough to understand that a man's truest measure is not what he does when the room is watching, but what he refuses to do when no one would stop him. I tell it now for a 3rd time, and I suspect a last, because I am old enough that certain memories begin to feel like debts. And this one, I think, deserves to be paid. My brother's name was Aldrich, the Duke of Thornville. Those of you who move in the circles of the great houses of England will not need the name explained. Those who do not, suffice it to say that in the year I speak of, he was 34 years old, possessed of a title older than most of the families who feared him, an estate that stretched across 2 river valleys and a range of hills, and a reputation that had been built, stone by careful stone, over a decade of cold decisions, iron contracts, and the particular quality of gaze that made men feel they had already lost whatever argument they were about to have. He was not cruel. I want that said plainly at the outset, because what follows might make a person wonder, and I will not have my brother misunderstood by anyone who hears this. He was not cruel. He was simply formed by a world that rewarded hardness and punished softness, and he had learned those lessons so thoroughly that for a long time he could not have told you where the lesson ended and the man began. That is not cruelty. That is armor. And armor, as any soldier will tell you, is only a problem when you cannot take it off. I was 4 years his junior and cut from a different cloth entirely. Or so our mother always said, with the particular fond exasperation of a woman who has produced one son who runs toward difficulty and another who produces it. I had a wife I adored, a comfortable living 2 days' ride from Thornville, and a habit of visiting my brother that he pretended to find unnecessary, and that I knew, from the particular way his shoulders loosened in the first hour, he had been quietly waiting for. I was at Thornville in the autumn of the year in question when the letter arrived. I remember the morning with the peculiar sharpness of mornings that change things. The mist was still in the valley. The breakfast things had not yet been cleared. My brother stood at the long window with the letter in his hand, reading it twice, and then set it on the table with the kind of careful deliberateness that meant he was deciding something and did not yet want to be asked about it. I asked about it. He told me there was to be an auction. Not a cattle auction, not an estate sale. A debt auction, the particular and ugly instrument by which a family of ruined means settled its accounts against the wishes of its remaining members, when the law allowed the creditor to call in what assets remained. Lord Harwick of Fenwick House had been the principal creditor of one Edmund Calloway, a gentleman farmer from the western counties who had died 18 months prior, leaving nothing but a mortgaged property, a stack of unpaid notes, and a daughter. The daughter, Harwick had written in a notice circulated to the appropriate gentleman, was 22, in good health, of adequate appearance, and would be presented alongside the remainder of the Calloway effects, the furniture, the silver plate, the horses, as settlement against the sum outstanding. The gentleman who bid highest would take her as wife, the debt considered discharged and the matter closed. Adequate appearance, I said, when Aldrich handed me the letter to read. I set it back down. The words sat in the room like something left out in bad weather. Yes, my brother said. And you intend to go? He did not answer, which was my brother's particular way of saying yes to things he had not yet decided how to justify. I went with him. I will not pretend this was entirely out of concern for Aldrich, because I would be lying. I went partly because I wanted to see what my brother would do, and partly because I thought that if someone was going to be in that room an object on behalf of common decency, it had better be someone with a dukedom at his back. Fenwick House was 2 hours by carriage, east through a stretch of lowland that grew progressively grayer as we traveled, as though the landscape itself was expressing an opinion. Harwick had assembled his guests in the great hall, a high-ceilinged room that in better days had been handsome but had acquired, over Harwick's tenure, the particular mustiness of a place where good taste had been replaced by accumulation. There were perhaps 30 men in the room. I recognized most of them. I will not list their names. What they had in common was that they were wealthy, that they were the kind of wealthy which licenses a certain confidence in one's own judgment, and that they were there for the auction. There was a low fire. There was wine that was better than the occasion merited. There was the particular buzz of men who are conducting what they know to be a distasteful business and have decided, collectively, to treat it as sport. Harwick greeted us at the door with the expression of a man who had not expected the Duke of Thornville to appear in person, and was not sure whether to be pleased or frightened. He settled on obsequious, which was his natural register. "Your Grace," he said, with the bow that men of his sort produce when they want something too deep, too held. "An honor, an unexpected honor." My brother said nothing. He moved through the room and found a position near the far wall, and the men around him rearranged themselves without quite noticing they had done so, the way water rearranges around a stone. I stood beside him. I looked at the low table at the front of the room where the Callaway effects had been arranged, the silver candlesticks, the books, the painted miniatures, the writing desk, the sum of a life set out for purchase. And then the door at the side opened, and she came in. I have tried over the years to describe her accurately, because accuracy is what the story deserves. She was not conventionally striking. She was a young woman of medium height, with dark hair that had been arranged with some care, and a dress that was clean and pressed but a season or two behind the fashion, which told you something about the care and nothing flattering about the circumstances. Her face was composed, that is the word, with the particular composure of someone who has made a decision, before entering a room, about what they will and will not allow the room to see. She held her hands at her sides. She did not look at the assembled men. She looked at the wall above them. Harwick stepped forward. He was enjoying himself. That was the thing I could not forgive him for, afterward, not the auction itself, which the law permitted and which I hold the law responsible for, but the enjoyment. The little lift at the corners of his mouth. "Gentlemen," he said, "the last of the Callaway effects. Miss Alara Callaway, 22, sound constitution. Adequate collateral against the outstanding sum. We begin the bidding at." The room moved. Not physically, no one shifted their feet or coughed or exchanged glances, but something in the room moved and I felt it, and I looked at my brother. My brother was watching the girl. He had gone very still, not the stillness of indifference. Aldrich's stillness of indifference I knew well, and it had a different quality, a settled blankness. This was the stillness of a man who has just registered something and is not yet certain what to do about it. He watched her stand there above the sneering room with her chin up, and her hands quiet and her gaze fixed on a point that was not any of them, and something crossed his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. I believe, looking back, that what he recognized was dignity, not the performed dignity of the titled and the trained, which is just good manners dressed in better clothes. The other kind, the dignity that is left when everything that can be taken has been taken and the person is still standing. He had been looking for something to respect for a very long time, in rooms full of people he could buy and sell and did, and he had not found it, and here it was in a room where it was least expected, standing with its hands at its sides and its eyes on the wall. The bidding began. I will not recount every offer. What I will tell you is that it proceeded briskly because the men in the room had money and the perverse cheerfulness that had settled over the business, and because Harwick knew how to run a room. The number climbed. I watched my brother. He had not moved, had not bid, had not, as far as I could see, blinked. When the number reached a figure that caused even the more enthusiastic bidders to fall quiet, one man remained. A Lord Greaves, red-faced and satisfied with himself, the kind of man who confuses acquisition with achievement. He looked around the room with the expression of someone expecting congratulations. My brother said a number, quite quietly, the way he said everything. It was exactly double what Greaves had bid. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Before, the quiet had been the pause of the auction. Now it was the quiet of 30 men realizing that the Duke of Thornville had just done something no one had expected, and no one was sure what it meant. Greaves looked at my brother. My brother looked at nothing in particular, with the distant, faintly bored expression he produced when he had finished with a thing. Greaves did not counter. Harwick cleared his throat. He named my brother the successful bidder. He smiled the smile of a man who has discharged a debt and is pleased about it. He began to speak about the formalities. The girl, Ilara, looked at my brother for the first time. I was watching her face when she did, because I had been watching her face since she entered the room, and what I saw was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was the expression of someone who has been delivered from one uncertain situation into another, and is not yet sure the exchange is an improvement. It was a look that assessed him, completely and without ceremony, the way you look at a locked door when you are not sure whether to be glad you are inside or worried about what the lock means. My brother met her gaze. He held it for exactly one moment. Then he turned to Harwick and said, in the same quiet tone, that he would want the papers drawn that evening, and that the lady would require a carriage and appropriate escort to Thornville. Not his estate, her destination. It was a small distinction. I noticed it. I suspect she did too. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell truthfully, because what happened in the weeks that followed at Thornville defies the kind of neat description that makes for satisfying telling. It was not a courtship. It was not a captivity. It was something else entirely, something that had no name in the vocabulary of the society that had produced them both, because the society had not anticipated that two people shaped by its hardest edges might, in proximity, begin to recognize something in each other that the society itself had no use for. She was installed in the East Wing, which had been the guest quarters and which was comfortable and private. She had the full use of the library, the gardens, and whatever else she wanted from the household, because my brother had told his staff, with the same quiet economy he used for everything, that she was under his protection and was to be treated accordingly. He gave no further instruction. He did not tell them what to call her or how to rank her presence in the house, because he had not yet determined those things himself, and my brother had never in his life offered an explanation he was not certain of. The staff, for their part, took their cue from Mrs. Tate, the housekeeper, who was a woman of 60 with strong opinions on practical matters, and complete indifference to any question that did not bear directly on the smooth management of the house. Mrs. Tate had observed the new arrival for 2 days and concluded that she was sensible, uncomplaining, and left rooms tidier than she found them, which ranked her above most guests the house had received in recent years. She assigned her a maid, ensured the fire in the East Wing sitting room was kept at a comfortable height, and when Ilara appeared in the kitchen passage on the 3rd morning asking if there was anything she might usefully do, Mrs. Tate handed her a stack of correspondence that needed sorting without any of the awkwardness that a different sort of housekeeper might have introduced into the transaction. This, I think, set the tone for what followed. She had the run of the house. She also had, from the beginning, the quality I had observed in the auction room, a precise, undeceivable intelligence that expressed itself not in argument, but in the particular silence she produced when someone said something foolish. That silence was eloquent. I was there often enough that autumn to be subjected to it more than once, and I will say that it was a considerably more effective rebuke than most things spoken aloud. It was not cold. It was simply accurate, the way a well-made instrument is accurate. And accuracy in the service of observation has a quality that most people interpret as unnerving because they are not accustomed to being seen clearly. She did not pretend to be grateful. She was not ungrateful precisely. She was honest, which is a different thing. When Mrs. Tate asked her whether the rooms were to her satisfaction, she said they were very fine and she was sensible of His Grace's generosity, and the tone of it was neither warm nor cold but level, like a well-surveyed road. When my brother himself, on the third day of her residence, appeared in the library where she was reading, and said he hoped she was comfortable, she looked at him over the top of the book and said that she was, and asked whether there was something he required. He stared at her. He was not accustomed to being asked whether there was something he required. Men did not ask the Duke of Thornville what he required, because it was understood that he would indicate it when he was ready, and the appropriate response was to prepare. Women did not ask him either, for reasons that ought to be obvious to anyone who has spent 5 minutes in the proximity of a powerful and forbidding duke. She asked him as though it were the most natural question in the world, as though he were someone who had wandered into a room where she happened to be sitting, and she was checking whether the visit had a purpose. He said, after a pause, that he only wanted to ensure she had everything she needed. She said she had everything she needed. She thanked him and returned to her book. He told me about this later, in the somewhat baffled tones of a man who has survived a battle he did not know he was fighting. I laughed. He looked at me with the expression of someone who does not find this amusing, and is aware that this response is itself unreasonable. She asked you what you wanted, I said, in your own library. It is her library at the moment, he said, which was an interesting correction. She was in the library most mornings. He had no particular reason to be in the library most mornings, having managed perfectly well without it for a decade. Nonetheless, he was in the library most mornings. He chose books from different shelves. He read at the other end of the long table. He did not, for the first 2 weeks, address her beyond the common courtesies, and she did not address him beyond the common courtesies, and I watched this from my chair near the fire with the interest of a man who has seen his brother practice restraint in business and politics in considerable difficulty, and never until now in anything that mattered. The two of them in a room together produced a quality of atmosphere I cannot readily name. They were not ignoring each other. Ignoring requires an active effort at suppression, and what was happening here was different. They were intensely aware of each other in the way that two people are when they have each concluded that the other is worth paying attention to and have not yet decided what to do about it. The air between them had the quality of a conversation that has not yet begun, but is already too full of things to be comfortable. He found reasons to be in rooms she was in. She did not leave rooms he entered. These are small facts. In the context of what I knew of my brother's usual conduct in his own house, they were remarkable ones. The thaw, because that is what it was, came in small increments. A passage she read aloud once, not to him, but in the tone of a person who has encountered something worth noting and is noting it. He asked what she had been reading. She read him the passage again directly and watched to see whether he found it worthwhile. He did. He said so. She appeared very briefly to believe him. She was not the sort of person who complimented easily or received compliments easily. Both required a credibility she was not quick to extend. When my brother said, in those early weeks, that some observation or piece of work she had done was well done, she looked at him with the assessing look she gave everything, to determine whether he meant it or was producing the polished social response. He always meant it. He was not, in his own way, capable of the polished social response. He had the bluntness of the genuinely powerful, who have no use for flattery because they have never needed it. She detected this, eventually. I watched her detect it, the slow alteration in how she received what he said, from assessment to something closer to consideration. There were conversations about the estate. She had noticed things walking the grounds that struck her as inefficient in the management of the home farm, and she said so without apology, with the same level directness she applied to everything. He listened, which surprised her, and then he implemented 2 of her suggestions, which surprised her more. She did not gush about it. She said once that she was glad the observation had been useful. He said it had been. They were quiet for a moment, and the quiet was companionable rather than empty. She had a way of making silences inhabitable. I noticed this in the weeks I spent at Thornville that autumn, the way her presence in a room changed the quality of the air, not by filling it with noise or performance, but by being entirely herself within it, without apology or display. It was restful in a way that the company of most people is not restful. My brother, who had spent 34 years in rooms where everyone was performing something, sat differently in the rooms where she was present, less braced, less far away. I stayed at Thornville longer than I had intended, and longer than my wife expected, and she forgave me for it when I came home in October and explained what I had been watching. She said it sounded like exactly what he needed, and she was sorry she had missed it. I said I was glad she had not, because if she had been there she would have interfered, and the thing required to be left alone to proceed at its own rate. She said I was probably right and poured me more tea, which is marriage. I went back in November. My brother was, by then, a man who had begun to exist differently in his own house. The change was not dramatic. Aldrich did not do dramatic in any direction. It was more that the quality of his attention had shifted. He who had previously given the impression of a man whose thoughts were always marginally elsewhere, conducting some interior accounting of the world's demands upon him, now appeared to be entirely present wherever he was. He was in the room he was in. He was listening to the conversation he was in. He was, and this is the most accurate word I have, there. I asked him once, in the privacy of his study late in the evening, what his intentions were. He said that she was under his protection and would remain so until she determined what she wished to do with her future. I pointed out that she had no means to do anything with her future unless he provided them, and that this was a situation requiring some clarity. He looked at his glass for a long time. He said that she was not a servant and not a ward and not a prisoner, and that he was aware the current arrangement was irregular, and that he did not yet know how to make it regular in a way that he stopped. In a way that what? I said. In a way that she would not find objectionable. I set my glass down. This was a new thing. The Duke of Thornville, who had negotiated the purchase of 3 estates, 7 commercial interests, and a stretch of parliamentary influence, and who had never in my memory indicated that anyone's potential objection was a relevant consideration in his planning. You could ask her, I said. He looked at me as though I had suggested something faintly dangerous. She will want to know why, he said. Yes, I agreed. He was quiet for a long time. The fire shifted. Outside, the November wind moved through the valley in a long, low note. He said, finally, that the difficulty was not in knowing what he wanted to say. The difficulty was in knowing whether he had earned the right to say it. She had arrived in his house through circumstances that were not of her choosing and not entirely to her advantage, and she was too clear-sighted not to know that the gratitude any woman in her position was expected to perform was a thing that would cost her a great deal and that he had not earned. He was aware that anything he said to her about what he felt, about the slow and unreasonable transformation that autumn had produced in him, the particular quality of attention she had unlocked in him that he had been missing without knowing it was missing. Anything he said in that vein would arrive weighted with the complications of her situation, and she would not be able to receive it without those complications in the room, and he was not sure he wanted to make her navigate that. I said, "You are describing the situation of a man who believes a woman cannot freely receive what he has to offer because she is dependent on him." Yes, he said. The solution to that, I said, is not to not offer it. The solution is to make her independent first and then offer it. He looked at me. That is what solicitors are for, I said. Have one draw something up, an endowment, her own income, her own security, not contingent on anything. Give it to her tomorrow morning before you say a word about what you feel. Then what you say to her will be said to a free woman." He was very still for a moment. Then he put down his glass and went to his desk and wrote a note to his solicitor. He said nothing more that evening. But the next morning he was in the library again, and I watched through the half-open door as he sat across from her and appeared to say something I could not hear. I saw him pass her a folded document, which she took and read, all of it, carefully, the way she did everything, and when she looked up her expression had the quality of someone who has been braced for a blow and received instead something they have no category for. He spoke again. She looked at the document and then at him, and she asked him something. He answered. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up from the document and appeared to answer, and he nodded very slowly, and her expression shifted, not to warmth exactly, but to something that was the first cousin of warmth, the kind of thing that precedes it when the person is being careful. I did not ask what was said. Some things are not mine to tell. What I can tell you is that November arrived, and the household settled into a rhythm that had not existed there before. She had begun to take a hand in the management of the household correspondence, at Mrs. Tate's request, initially, because Mrs. Tate was a practical woman who recognized competence and had no patience for protocol that stood in the way of it. Alara wrote letters with a precision and an economy that my brother, reviewing them at her request, said were better than his secretary's. He said this without quite looking at her. She said, without quite looking at him, that she was glad to be of use. The word use had a valence in it, not bitterness, exactly, but awareness, as though she was still waiting to understand what the arrangement would settle into, and was not yet willing to rest in it. He heard the valence. I know he heard it because he looked up from the letter he was reading, very briefly, and I saw his jaw tighten with the look of a man who wants to say something and has not yet found the right form for it. He did not find the right form for it before the second letter from Harwick arrived. It came in the 3rd week of November, addressed to my brother, and it was not a long letter, but it was a dense one. Harwick had, upon reviewing the Callaway accounts with greater attention, identified additional sums outstanding, sums, he claimed, that predated the auction settlement and were not covered by the transaction. He wanted payment, or failing payment. He wanted the matter of Miss Callaway's status clarified in a manner that satisfied his remaining claim. The letter was, in plain terms, an attempt to reopen a closed deal. It was the kind of letter that Harwick clearly believed he could send to any man of sufficient means and extract a second payment from, counting on the man's desire to avoid complication. Harwick had made a significant miscalculation. My brother read the letter at the breakfast table which I was sharing with him that morning while Alara was in the garden. He set it down. He was quiet for 30 seconds. When he looked up, his face had the quality I had seen it take in court cases and estate disputes, not angry, which would have been warmer, still, like water that has frozen through. He said, "He thinks I do not wish this made a public matter." "He does," I said. "He is wrong," my brother said. He wrote back that morning. The letter was short. It noted that the Callaway debt had been discharged in full and in the presence of witnesses, and that any additional claims against that account were either fraudulent or the result of Harwick's failure to present a complete accounting before the auction, which was his own error and his own liability. It further noted that the Duke of Thornville had every intention of making this position clear to the appropriate parties, including the Lord Chancellor's office, if Harwick wished to press the matter. He sent a copy of both letters to his solicitor. He sent a third copy to a colleague in the Lords whom he trusted and who did not like Harwick. He did not mention any of this to Alara. She found out, of course. This is the thing about a household with a competent and attentive woman in it. Very little passes unnoticed. Mrs. Tate did not tell her directly, but Mrs. Tate had the habit of expressing concern through an increased attentiveness to practical detail, and Alara had lived in enough uncertain houses to recognize the signs. She came to find me, not my brother, me. I was in the East Garden, which was bare in November but retained a certain austere dignity, and she appeared at the garden door with a shawl over her shoulders, and the direct look she had been giving me since approximately our third conversation, when she had concluded I would answer questions honestly. She asked me what was in the letter from Harwick. I told her, I am not in the habit of deceiving people who ask me direct questions, and I had long since determined that she was not someone whose interest in the truth could be managed by a softened version of it. She was quiet for a moment. The garden was very still. A blackbird crossed the sky above the wall. He is protecting himself, she said finally. The Duke, not me. He is doing both, I said. I do not believe you should separate them. They are not the same thing, she said. No, I agreed, but they are not as separate as you seem to want them to be. She looked at me with the look that meant she was considering this, and was not yet decided. Then she said, very quietly, that she was not in the habit of being beholden to people, and that she was not sure what to do in the situation she found herself in, and that the uncertainty was uncomfortable. I imagine it is, I said. I am not ungrateful, she said. I want that understood. I know, I said. He knows. You are simply not accustomed to gratitude that does not cost you something. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned and went back into the house, and I stood in the cold garden and thought that my brother had found something extraordinary and did not know what to do with it, and that she had found something she had not been looking for and was refusing to let herself need it, which is the particular difficulty of people who have learned to be careful. That evening she went to find him. I was not present. I learned what passed between them from my brother later that night in the study, and I will tell it as he told it to me, with the particular halting care of a man who is not accustomed to speaking about things that matter. She came to his study and told him about the letter. He said he was aware of it. She said she knew he was aware of it and she wanted to know what he intended. He told her what he had done, the letters to Harwick, the solicitor, the colleague. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked him why. He told her it was a matter of principle. She said that was not an answer. He looked at her. He said, after a pause, that the better answer was that he did not intend to allow anyone to threaten what was in his care. She asked whether that was what she was, in his care. He said that was an imprecise description, but the nearest one available given the current arrangement, and that if she found it objectionable, he was prepared to discuss what arrangement she would prefer. She said that what she would prefer was to know plainly what he wanted of her. And here my brother paused in the telling for what seemed like quite a long time. I waited. He looked at his hands. He said that what he wanted was to explain to her that the auction and the letter and Harwick and all the apparatus of the situation were not what was relevant, as far as he was concerned, and had not been for some time, and that what was relevant was something that he was aware she had every reason to approach with suspicion, and that he was not going to ask anything of her that she did not freely offer, but that he wanted her to know it was there. He did not say it in precisely those words. My brother did not have a gift for the romantic speech. What he told me was that he said it badly and in parts and with a good deal of silence between the parts, and that she listened without expression while he did, and that when he finished she said nothing for a long moment. And then she said that she was aware of it too. Just that. She said she was aware of it too, and that she did not know what to do with it, and that she needed him to be patient with her while she worked out what she could offer that was honest. He told me that this, a woman warning him in advance that she needed patience and honesty, was the most direct communication he had received on a personal matter in his adult life. I said I believed him. He said he found it considerably more affecting than any declaration he could name. I said I believed that too. Harwick did not let the matter die. This is the nature of men like Harwick. They interpret patience as weakness and silence as permission, and they press until they hit something solid. What he pressed in the weeks that followed was the social avenue. He let it be known, in the drawing rooms and clubs and dinner tables of the appropriate circles, that the Duke of Thornville's new domestic arrangement was of a character that raised questions about propriety. He did not say it plainly. Men like Harwick never say anything plainly. They murmur it, and the murmur does its work in the cracks. My brother heard about this because he heard about everything. Alara heard about it too, because she was more plugged into the household and social currents than anyone gave her credit for. She had a quality of still attention that meant people spoke freely near her, and then realized afterward that she had been listening. She did not seem frightened by it. This was the remarkable thing. She seemed almost braced for it, in the way of someone who has been told the weather will be bad and has dressed accordingly. She told me, one afternoon in the library, that this was the predictable response to her situation, and she had expected it long before Harwick began to murmur. "What do you intend to do about it?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "It is not mine to address." "And if he were to address it?" She looked at the fire. "Then I suppose we would see." We saw in January. Harwick had arranged, or rather had inserted himself into an arrangement that had already been made, a gathering at Ashmore House, which was a sufficiently grand venue that declining the invitation would itself be noticed. It was the kind of occasion where the season's social accounts were settled, alliances confirmed, reputations assessed, the general order of things reaffirmed by the presence and absence of those who mattered. My brother attended. Alara attended at his invitation, and here I want to be precise about the form of the invitation, because the form mattered. He did not instruct her to come. He did not arrange her attendance as a piece of social management. He came to her sitting room the morning of, and he stood in the doorway in his coat, and he said that he was going to Ashmore House, and that he would like her company if she was willing to give it, and that whatever happened in that room he intended to make clear who she was and what her place in his household was, and that he wanted her to know that before she decided whether to come. She came. I am going to skip the first half of the evening because it was the usual sort of thing. The great rooms, the candlelight, the assembled company performing the rituals of their kind, and the particular undercurrent that runs through a room when something is expected to happen, and no one is quite sure what form it will take. I will say this much of the first half: she was not out of place. That may sound like a small thing, but it was not. She had no title. She had no family present, no shield of position or connection. She had the dress Mrs. Tate had found for her and her own bearing, and the same level directness she brought to every room she entered, and somehow these were sufficient. The women she was introduced to seemed uncertain at first, uncertain what to make of her, how to rank her, what conversational register to adopt, and she answered the uncertainty by simply being there, entirely, without the performance of either deference or confidence, and people responded to it the way people always respond to someone who is genuinely present. They turned toward her without knowing quite why. My brother watched this from across the room. He watched it with the expression of a man who is not surprised by what he sees but is moved by it, which is different from being surprised, and in some ways harder. Harwick arrived at the midpoint of the evening with a small coterie of allies and the satisfied expression of a man who has arranged something. He was the sort of man who moves through rooms with the assumption of welcome, and the assumption generally holds because people are too polite or too cautious to withdraw it. He made his way through the company with his glass in hand and his smile in place, and he arrived, eventually, at the position where my brother was standing, near the fireplace, in a circle that had formed around him as circles always did, because powerful men create gravity without trying. Alara was 2 steps to his left. She was wearing a deep green gown that Mrs. Tate had sourced from somewhere, not the finest gown in the room, but one that fitted her well and had been chosen with the same quiet attention to practicality she brought to everything. She was speaking, when Harwick arrived, to the wife of one of my brother's colleagues, and the conversation appeared to be going well, with the ease of two people who have found a subject they are both actually interested in. She did not look up when Harwick appeared. I do not know whether this was deliberate. Harwick did not address my brother directly. He addressed the room, the assembled company, with the easy manner of a man who believes he is welcome everywhere and has the particular blindness of the chronically comfortable. He said, and I want to give you his exact words, because the exact words matter, that it was a pleasure to see the Duke of Thornville and his household well represented, and that the young woman with him had certainly come a considerable distance since the autumn's proceedings. The last three words. I watched the room receive them. The women nearest to Alara exchanged glances of the type that do not require a word. The men shifted almost imperceptibly, with the particular discomfort of those who recognize an ugliness in their midst and have not yet determined whether to address it or to look away. The wife Alara had been speaking with touched her own wrist, an involuntary gesture, the instinct toward the person beside you when something is thrown at them. I watched Alara receive them. She went very still, not the stillness of shock. She had been expecting something of this kind. I knew she had because she had said as much in the garden. It was the stillness of someone who has been expecting something unpleasant and has now confirmed its arrival and is in the fraction of a second between the confirmation and the response. She did not flinch. She did not look at my brother. She looked, very briefly, at a point just past Harwick's shoulder, the way she had looked at the wall above the assembled bidders on the day of the auction. That same quality of fixing her gaze somewhere beyond the room, somewhere the room could not touch. My brother turned his head and looked at Harwick. Just looked at him, for 2 seconds, the way the sky looks right before it does something irrevocable. Then he turned to Alara, not to the room, not to Harwick, to her only. He said her name, quietly, just her name, the way you say someone's name when you want their full attention and want them to know that your full attention is already entirely theirs. She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in that held gaze asked a question that she had been asked once before, in a study, about patience and honesty and what she could offer that was true. She gave him the answer with her eyes, without words. And then he turned back to the room. He said, in the voice he used when he had decided something, which was the same voice he used for everything else except that it carried the additional weight of absolute finality, that he wished to clarify something for the benefit of the assembled company, since it appeared that Lord Harwick had a fondness for imprecision. He said that the young woman beside him was Miss Alara Calloway, formerly of the Western Counties, currently resident at Thornville as its future mistress, a status she had accepted at his request and which he was honored by, and which he intended to formalize before the spring. He said that she was a woman of considerable intelligence, ability, and character, and that the proceedings of the autumn, to which Harwick alluded, had been conducted against her interest, and resolved by him not out of charity, but out of the very simple recognition that no man of worth leaves a woman of worth at the mercy of a creditor with bad accounts and worse intentions. He said this last part directly to Harwick, in the particular tone of voice that he reserved for final statements, the kind that do not invite reply. The room was absolutely silent. Harwick was the color of a man who has realized, some time after the carriage has passed, that he was standing in its way. His mouth opened. Whatever it contained, he thought better of it. The small coterie of allies that had accompanied him into the room had, in the way of such alliances, already begun to find things to look at in other directions. My brother turned back to Alara. She was looking at him with the expression I had not seen on her face before, not in the auction room, not in the library, not in the garden, not in the months of careful, incremental understanding that had been happening between them in the house on the hill. It was the expression of someone who has kept a long guard and has found, in a single moment, that the thing they were guarding against was not a threat but something else entirely, and the guard is no longer necessary, and the relief of that is almost too large to manage in a room full of candlelight and company. She did not say anything. Not then, not in the room. She was not a woman who said things in rooms that were meant for somewhere else. She simply stood beside him, and her chin came up, and the green of her gown was warm in the candlelight, and the assembled company of England's finest looked at them both and understood what they were seeing. The wife Alara had been speaking with said something to her, quietly, intended only for her. I did not hear it. Alara glanced at her and something crossed her face that was close to a smile, quick, private, real. Harwick departed soon after. He did not say goodbye. We left early. Not in flight, there was no hurry or disarray about it. My brother made his farewells with the same economy he brought to arrivals, and Alara did the same, and there was a quality to the leave-taking of the evening that had the feeling of something closed, not abandoned, a door shut properly rather than left ajar. On the steps my brother handed Alara into the carriage. She went, he followed, the door closed. I stood on the steps and watched the carriage move down the long drive, and the lantern on the back of it diminished through the bare winter trees, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. What passed in that carriage, I do not know directly. My brother told me something of it the following morning in the way he told me things in fragments, with silences between them that I had learned over a lifetime to read. He said that she had looked out the carriage window for a long time without speaking, and that he had waited because he had learned, over the months of the autumn, that slow accumulation of understanding, that her silences were not empty, and the thing they were full of was worth waiting for. She said, finally, that she had not expected him to say those things in that room. He said that he had been intending to say them since September, and had been looking for the right occasion, and that Harwick had inadvertently provided one. She was quiet again for a moment. She said that she was glad it was said. He asked whether she was all right. She said she was quite all right. She said it with the level directness she used for true things, and he believed her. Then she reached across the dark carriage and put her hand over his, briefly, without ceremony. The way you touch something you want to know is real. He did not move. He did not speak. He sat very still in the dark of the carriage, with her hand over his and the winter trees going past the window, and felt something so far from the life he had been building for 34 years that he had no name for it and did not, for once, feel the need of one. I traveled back to Thornville the following morning rather than returning to my own house, because I wanted to know. I know that is not a dignified reason. I had long since given up pretending to dignity where my brother and this woman were concerned. I found them in the library, sitting at the long table, which was strewn with correspondence and the household accounts she had been working on with him. He was reading something she had written and making a note in the margin. She was watching him do it, and the expression on her face was the one that the evening before had been new and overwhelming, and this morning was still new and still large, but had settled somewhat, the way the sea settles after a storm, still full of what the storm put there but quieter. She looked up when I came in and she said good morning, and the good morning had something in it that had not been there before. Warmth, not performed, the real kind. My brother looked up too. He looked at me with the particular expression that meant he knew I was there, because I wanted to know how things stood, and he found this predictable, and did not, in fact, mind. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. "I trust the evening was." "Satisfactory," he said. "Considerably more than satisfactory," she said, at almost the same moment. They looked at each other. My brother's face did something that I can only describe as the face of a man who has been wearing armor for a very long time, and has just taken it off in good light, and found that what was under it is not as damaged as he feared. I sat down in my chair by the fire and picked up a book, and did not read a word of it. The engagement was announced in February. It was done in the correct manner: the notice to the papers, the letters to the family, the necessary social machinery. But the announcement that mattered had already been made in a candle-lit room in January, and everyone who needed to know it already knew. Harwick did not press his additional claims. I am told he spent a considerable time discovering that his additional claims were, in fact, not supportable, and that pursuing them would require him to explain to the Lord Chancellor's office the precise basis on which he had conducted the autumn's auction, which was a line of inquiry he concluded he did not wish to open. The wedding was in May. The church was full, fuller than I had expected, which told me something about the social arithmetic of the preceding months. The people who had been present at Ashmore House in January had, to their credit, understood what they had witnessed and drawn the appropriate conclusions about where their goodwill was best directed. Several of the women who had been in the room on that evening were in the front rows of the church, and they sat with the particular posture of people who know they are present at something worth witnessing. My brother stood at the altar with an expression I had not seen on his face since we were very young, since before the title, the weight, the careful construction of the Duke of Thornville. He looked like what he was, underneath all of it, a man who had found something worth the finding and knew, now that he had found it, the dimensions of everything he had been missing. That is a particular look. It is not comfortable. It is the look of someone who has been given, unexpectedly, the standard against which the rest of his life will now be measured, and finds the standard both more demanding and more sustaining than anything he had previously held himself to. She came down the aisle in white silk, with her dark hair arranged in the style she preferred, simple, practical, entirely herself. She wore no jewels except a single strand of pearls that had been her mother's, which Mrs. Tate had discovered she possessed and pressed her to wear, and which she had consented to on the grounds that her mother had liked them and she was glad of the connection. She walked without hurry. She held no one's arm. She had no father to give her away, and she had not asked anyone to stand in his place, because she had said, when the question arose, that she had given herself this far and she would give herself the rest of the way. She looked at him all the way down, not at the guests, not at the altar, at him. He held himself very still until she reached him, and then he took her hand, and the stillness changed, from the stillness of waiting to the stillness of arrived, the stillness of someone who has been a long time in motion and has, finally, completely, stopped somewhere that is home. He wept at the vows, not obviously, not in the way that produces handkerchiefs and whispers. Just the jaw-set look of a man whose face has become briefly too full of something to maintain its usual economy of expression, and the brightness in the eye that he blinked once and contained, and then did not entirely contain. She saw it. I watched her see it, the small change in her face when she did, the softening of the careful composure she had maintained all the way down the aisle, so that for a moment she was just herself, completely, and looking at him in a way that required no witness and received one anyway. I know all of this because I was watching him, and because I know his face as well as I know my own. My wife beside me took my hand. She knew I was watching him because she knew me as well as she knew her own face. Afterward, at the supper, I found myself beside my brother in the brief gap between one piece of music and the next, while the new Duchess was occupied with the particular business of being congratulated by a long line of people she barely knew. He stood at the edge of the room with a glass he was not drinking, watching her across the space. I said, "You are looking at her the way you look at things you cannot believe you have." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I used to think the difficulty of a thing was an indication of its worth, that the price was the proof." "And now," I said. He watched her laugh at something a stranger said, a real laugh, not a social one, the laugh that had appeared slowly over the autumn and winter, and that I had first heard in the garden one afternoon when the housekeeper's cat had done something undignified with a ball of wool. He said, "Now I think the only difficulty worth measuring is whether I am worth what she gave." I did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. She looked across the room then and found him without searching. The way people find each other when they have been paying that particular kind of attention for long enough that it becomes something automatic, something underneath thought. She held his gaze for a moment, across the room and the candlelight and the assembled company of their world. And then she turned back to her conversation, and he turned back to his glass, and the music began again. She was worth everything he had paid. He was worth everything she had offered. This is what the story says when you stand back from it and let it say what it means. I am an old man now, and I have seen a great deal of the world's business conducted in the registers that men of my brother's station use: the cold register, the contractual register, the register of power and calculation and management. I have been party to arrangements that were dignified and arrangements that were not, and I have watched the machinery of society sort people into their allotted positions, with the efficiency of something that has been doing it for a very long time, and does not find it difficult. What I have not seen often, what I have not seen, in fact, in any other instance, is a man of that world turn the full force of the machinery around, not against a woman, for her, publicly, permanently, at considerable cost to the ease of his position and none at all to his dignity. My brother was the most feared man in 4 counties. He was also, by the end of that year, the most devoted husband I have ever had the privilege of observing at close range. Lord Harwick left for the continent the following spring, and did not return in any form that I was aware of. The estate and its affairs passed to someone more careful about his accounting. The home farm improvements Elara had suggested in the autumn of her first year at Thornville were fully implemented by the following spring, and produced a yield that my brother declared the best in 15 years. He told me this in a letter. He also told me that his wife had begun a correspondence with 2 other estates on the subject of soil management and autumn drainage, and that he found this entirely unremarkable. I wrote back and told him it was entirely remarkable. He wrote back and said that she would be pleased to hear it, but that in his experience she did not require his assessment of what was remarkable about her, having a perfectly accurate one of her own. He was right, she did. This is what I mean when I say that love, properly arrived at, does not diminish the people in it. It finds them as they are and holds them there. She was worth finding. He was worth the waiting that found him. The debt, in the end, was the least of it, a small, ugly instrument that the world had used to try to determine her value, and that had put her, by the most improbable route, exactly where she was meant to be. Neither of them ever mentioned it again, as far as I knew. They had no need to. What it had produced was far larger than what it had attempted. I have told this story twice in my life before today. I find, finishing it now, that the thing I have wanted to convey most clearly is not the auction or Ashmore House, or the January evening or the May wedding, though all of those are true and all of them matter. What I have wanted to convey is this. A young woman stood in a room full of men with her eyes on the wall above them, and refused to let any of what was happening to her be the final word on what she was. And a man who had spent 30 years being the most feared presence in every room he entered looked at her and found, for the first time, something worth being afraid of losing. That is the whole of it. That is the only part that matters.